The Wailing Caverns, the underground source of the lush and verdant oases of the Barrens, but also a place where nature itself has turned foul, and one man's nightmare threatens to engulf everything. I'm Shuppzy, and in this episode of Warcraft Space and Story, we're going to see how game design and lore begin to build and develop the view you have of the world and story, and what your place is in it. Being placed in the mid-teen levels, the Wailing Caverns were the second ever dungeon for many people, and as such, had the duty of continuing on from the Dungeon 101 class that was Ragefire Chasm. There's a similar connection to be seen between the Dead Mines and Stockades over in the Eastern Kingdoms. However, rather than being built up throughout a whole zone, the Wailing Caverns were placed in a way for you to stumble upon them as you cleared centaur influence from the oases and slowly discovered there was something deeply wrong about them. As to the dungeon entrance itself, it's a horrible cliche really, but short of an actual danger sign, skull caves communicate immediately. There is adventure to be had, but parties should probably be gathered beforehand. That said, the length of the Wailing Caverns pre-dungeon is actually quite noticeable, as it has a number of potential boss spawns and quests that can be completed in it, which all serves to make getting to the dungeon part of the adventure itself. Just before the dungeon proper, the game invites you to look out over this view, and I think it's one that really cements the visuals of the Wailing Caverns, being a sort of hybrid of cave and jungle. And as we'll see throughout the dungeon, different sections play with the balance between these two themes to make each distinct and memorable. Upon entering the dungeon, you immediately encounter Muyo, the disciple of Naralex. Muyo tells you that the cause of the disturbances in nature throughout the Barrens are due to his master trying to use this place to channel the Emerald Dream and regrow the entire zone, but instead he allowed the nightmare to seep through and corrupt most of his followers. Even nowadays, some of the details of the Emerald Dream and Nightmare aren't totally clear, but back when this place was a new experience, the concept would have seemed positively surreal. Which is fitting, really. The long path behind Muyo feels poignantly cold and forbidding, as groups of deviate raptors crowd around long-dead Kodo bones. The deviate thing is actually interesting to bring up, because it's a mob adjective that belongs solely to the Wailing Caverns, and I'd say most of us have played around with the savoury Deviate Delight costumes before. The lore about them is that the parts of the nightmare slipping into this place through Naralex are mutating both the flora and fauna to be more hostile and dangerous. We round the first corner here and encounter Lady Anacondra, surrounded by a ring of torches and casting away at something no doubt evil. Lady Anacondra is one of the druids of the Fang, and formerly an apprentice druid known as Scarlet Leaf, who signed on to join Naralex's expedition. The Druids of the Fang, being a fledgling organisation with the potential to grow very dangerous, means they're a great enemy to set less experienced players up against. And maybe it's just me, but there's also something weirdly endearing about a group of people who decide to start wearing silly matching uniforms, refer to themselves as Lady and Lord, and use cool animal nicknames. It's worth mentioning that this first section of the Wailing Caverns is absolutely massive, and you can even find Naralex before doing any other boss, but of course our mission is to awaken him, not just find him. As to the size of the space, Lady Anacondra used to have multiple spawn points, and there seems to be an intentional choice to give more room to explore and a less linear feel in the Wailing Caverns compared to Ragefire Chasm, which is good for when you needed to hunt down that last piece of Serpent Bloom because your party members took it all. So from the first room, there are two paths, and the way they're highlighted is incredibly simple, yet I think quite elegant. The torches that marked out the bridges earlier now become the arches we pass under to go to a new section of the dungeon. And the section we're going to go through first is the Pit of Fangs, which as we can see definitely tips the balance in favour of the cave aesthetics. The movement through here is a long, winding ascension filled with, as you may have guessed, snakes, cobras, and of course, the Druids of the Fang. Halfway up the coiling path, we meet Lord Pythos, who's surrounded by supplies, resources, and sacks of coins, which clues us into the fact he's a bit more materially minded than the other Fang Lords. In fact, the Dungeon Journal tells us he was a warrior named Aaron, who had begun to study Druidism under his friend Naralex. So just like Anacondra, Lord Pythos was moved around in the Cataclysm revamp of the Wailing Caverns, but his move was a little bit more dramatic. So here's the original map of the Wailing Caverns, and here's the new map. As you can see, a good quarter to a third of the dungeon was cut, the majority of which being what Blizzard called the maze section, which, as the name indicated, was confusing, winding, and had things like jumping puzzles and other non-traditional stuff. So what we're seeing is a sort of change in philosophy by Blizzard as to what dungeons are. Moving on from Pythos though, we continue to weave our way up the Pit of Fangs, and as we reach the top, we see a campfire at the end of the path. Fire, as we've already seen in the Wailing Caverns, is our point of interest marker, so we almost know even before we can see around the corner that whatever is by there is important. And the person who's up there is of course Lord Cobran. He was once Jarlaxle and a prodigy within the Cenarian Circle at changing into animal forms. So despite being the Fang Lords, only Cobran seems to have mastered his serpent form. Once we kill Cobran, we're faced with an interesting choice: walk all the way back down the coil, or risk a jump to the bottom of the pit. I don't know about you guys, but I'd have probably jumped, except for these handy little rocks, highlighted by fire, from the candles. That makes getting back down so much easier. We pass once again under a bridge arch and work our way into the Crag of the Ever-Living. Before we get into that proper though, let's talk quickly about Kresh. So Kresh is a big, old, neutral turtle who patrols between the start of the pit and the start of the crag. The lore says he's resisted the corruption of the Wailing Caverns and has mostly just kept on going with his life thus far. What makes him interesting though, especially back in the day, is that he dropped a cool looking rare shield at a level where rare anything was quite surprising. As we round the corner into the Crag of the Ever-Living, this multi-stream waterfall appears before us, and all of a sudden everything is much more lush and verdant, so basically the inverse theming of what we saw in the pit. Here we find Scum, who is another ancient denizen of the Wailing Caverns, and going by the Kodo bones at the beginning of the dungeon, we can guess at one point the caverns were a graveyard for the Baron's Kodo. But unlike Kresh, he has fallen to the nightmare. Originally Scum was found in a pen further in within the maze of the dungeon, which worked to legitimize the Druids of the Fang as a threat, mastering the old and powerful aspects of this place. But placed where he is now, he's basically the introduction to the crag, being a Stegosaurus rhino thing in a section of the dungeon that has a definite Jurassic feel to it. Something interesting to note is that, like the Pit of Fangs, we're also ascending again. Likely that would be to add a level of punishment for missing a jump or walking off the edge within the maze that this used to feed into. A cute little thing to notice here is that Blizzard really likes leading us to stand not only in front of, but behind waterfalls. We saw the same thing back in Moradon, and there are plenty of examples out in the world. It's quite clever when you think about it, because you get two really nice looking vistas for players to appreciate, for the price of one. We continue to ascend the crag further and further upwards until it eventually plateaus, and we see by the far wall another Fang Lord in his ritual circle. This is Lord Serpentis, who, like Scum before him, refuses to let me get a good shot. We see his uniform and weaponry are a bit more developed than the other Druids of the Fang or even the Fang Lords, because he's their leader. His lore says he desperately wanted to be regarded as a Shando or honoured teacher within the Cenarian Circle like Naralex, so thanks to the Nightmare, he saw his opportunity and formed the Druids of the Fang from the now abandoned feeling followers of Naralex. Before we move towards the last parts of this dungeon, there's something quite interesting I just want to note about Naralex's followers. Not a single one of the Tauren that came with him seemed to have been corrupted. It's very, very subtle, but given that this was by far a mostly horde-accessible dungeon, it seems to almost prod the player and say, gosh, those night elves, always getting in over their heads and having delusions of grandeur. Good thing the Tauren are around. I'll freely admit it's a tiny thing, but given how core the faction system is to Warcraft both as a game and as a story, seeing these little bits that help create that us versus them divide is kinda cool. Immediately after Serpentis, genuinely immediately after, we find Verdun the Ever-Living, a massive bog beast guarding a pass behind him. The lore for Verdun states he predates Naralex and thus the Nightmare in the Wailing Caverns, but like most everything else that's not Tauren or Turtle, he's been corrupted and now works with the Druids of the Fang, building their base of power and spreading the corruption further and further. Behind Verdun, we have this drop that takes us all the way down to the river in the first room. Without these means of quickly returning to important areas, I'd wager that Wailing Caverns would be remembered as one of the most frustrating dungeons, so the existence is very, very welcome. With the Fang Lords dead, we return to the disciple of Naralex and ask him to begin the ceremony of awakening. Don't be fooled by what you're seeing now though. For many years, Muyo walked very slowly through most of the dungeon, as he cleansed the Fang Lord's presence and would draw aggro from basically anything you thought you could skip. Eventually, we escort Muyo to this room, where upon an altar in the dead center we find Naralex himself, trapped in the nightmare. All around him we see candles, torches and stone braziers, reinforcing the significance of fire as a point marker in this dungeon. Muyo begins the ritual, and almost immediately we're set upon by waves of serpents and slimes. This is where the shape of the room comes into play, as mobs spawn from all around the ring of water, and you have to watch every side to pass the event. Eventually though, something entirely unique to the dungeon emerges from the water, covered in slime. Mutinous the Devourer. The lore seems to suggest Mutinous is not actually a creature of the Wailing Caverns, but something from Naralex's mind made manifest thanks to the nightmare. A Murloc seems like an odd choice for an end boss, as even when they're quite large they still look goofy, but remember that Murlocs are really rare in Kalimdor compared to the Eastern Kingdoms, so it's almost another attempt to create those little differences in how players perceive the world. To those who spent time in Kalimdor, the word Murloc conjures up images of this guy, the ending to a long, challenging dungeon adventure, but for others, Murlocs were super frustrating little mobs that got slaughtered by the dozen. So we close the story of the Wailing Caverns as the proactive heroes. Our adventures led us to discover a growing problem, but rather than let it fester, we banded together and delved into its source, where we found unnaturally mutated monsters, the beginnings of a dangerous cult, and an ever-opening door for what we'd later know as one of the biggest threats Azeroth would have to face, the old god-created nightmare. I've been Shuppzy, and that was the story of the space, and how the space has told the story. I hope you enjoyed this video. For those awesome people following along with the series, I'm sorry the 2-week production cycle thing has been such a bust thus far. It's always such a help as well when you guys like, subscribe and share these, and it's so great to hear from you, whether it's suggestions of where to go next or some constructive criticism. So thank you for your time.